Hello, government students. This is a lecture for Learning Module 12 on political behavior. This learning module will cover several different topics: politics and political parties, voting, political polling, and political socialization. At the end of this learning module, these are the tasks that you should be able to do. Come back to this when you get ready to study for the exam and see if you can. We'll start then with politics and political behavior, with first of all, just a quick introduction. How do we define politics? You hear the word thrown around a lot, but have you ever really thought about what it means? Your textbook defines politics this way. Politics refers to the process by which we decide how finite resources will be allocated and which economic and social policies government will pursue or which values government will support. The goal of politics is policy implementation. Policy implementation is when our government executes an adopted policy that is specified in legislation. As you should recall from Module 11, policy implementation is most often accomplished through the work of government agencies or bureaucracies. But politics depends upon citizen engagement for it to work. Government cannot serve the people if it does not know what the people want or need. So, how do the people inform the government of what they want and need? Well, the obvious answer is voting. People communicate their values through voting for representatives and legislation. But there are less used ways to communicate our values and priorities to our government leaders. We can also do this through directly communicating with our elected leaders. Earlier in the semester, you were asked to identify who your senators and representatives were. So you should know now that they each have an email account and they each have phone numbers. It is not hard to voice your opinion to your members in Congress. Even if you doubt their willingness to carry your priorities into law, voicing your opinion to them teaches them what matters to their voters. If you remain silent, they will assume no one disagrees with what they were doing, and they will continue with the status quo. Other important aspects of citizen engagement with politics include staying informed, learning, understanding, and discussing public policies with other people, attending debates or political meetings, actively getting involved in a campaign or joining an advocacy organization. Responding to political polls is also a way that you can show your elected representatives what your values are. Now, these are all forms of citizen engagement that can occur on an individual basis. But citizen engagement can also occur through collective action, and that's what I'm going to move to next. We'll start with political parties. Political parties are groups of people with similar interests who work together to create public policies and support their implementation. As you likely know, the two dominant political parties in America are the Republican Party, symbolized by an elephant, and the Democratic Party, symbolized by a donkey. Political parties seek to gain control over the government by winning elections. Political parties nominate candidates to run for state office, for national office, Congress, and the presidency. They coordinate political campaigns and mobilize voters. Political parties also create party platforms that guide members of Congress and state legislatures in drafting legislation. A party platform is a literal document that lists the party's position on various issues. It is written and voted on by party members at the national conventions that they hold every 4 years just before a presidential election. Recall from a prior module that political parties have leadership positions in each chamber of Congress, and the party leadership will guide proposed laws through the lawmaking process and inform party members on how they should vote on proposed bills. That's why and how party platforms become so useful. Collective action can also take the form of interest groups. Interest groups are groups of people with similar interests who work together to create and advocate policies. Interest groups and political parties will sound a lot alike, but they are different. To better understand what political parties and interest groups are, we should compare and contrast them. Both are forms of collective action. Both seek to influence public policy, and both are involved in the democratic process. But political parties tend to be more focused on elections. Parties in both chambers of Congress organize policies into written laws that are debated on and voted on. These laws will reflect the party's platform, which will cover all the issues of the day. Special interest groups are defined by a specific interest that matters to the group. An interest group could be a single issue group. It could be a trade association. It could be a single company. The participation of interest groups in the election process is less about the party that the candidate represents and more about the candidate's support for a specific interest. Interest groups are heavily involved in the democratic process, but it's through lobbying, sending their representatives to persuade lawmakers. Examples would be the AARP, American Association of Retired People. Their lobbyists would advocate for issues that matter to older people in the population. The NAACP, that is an interest group that represents African Americans and the cause of civil rights. The AAUP, American Association of University Professors, is another interest group. The NRA, the National Rifle Association, that might be considered a single issue interest group. Before we go further into our discussion of political parties, recall the concern that the founding generation of political leaders had about partisanship. In Federalist Number 10, James Madison wrote of his concern about factions, and he defined factions in this way. By a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens, or to the permanent and aggregate interest of the community. We may not consider political parties or interest groups as fitting Madison's definition of faction because neither of them are necessarily adverse to the rights of others. Both political parties and interest groups would profess a goal of benefiting the common good, the good of all. And having divergent voices in the political process can have positive and negative views on negative effects on politics. At a minimum, divergent voices will force consideration of divergent interests and values and then lead to compromise. But political partisanship can get ugly, and political leaders fall victim to their passions and sometimes behave very badly, as depicted here in this image of the caning of Charles Sumner by South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks. This was a real event that happened as Congress was debating the spread of slavery into the western states. So our founders were wise to warn us of the rise of factions, but they likely understood that partisanship was inevitable. So let's now move to a study of how divergent voices of the founding generation merged into organized political parties. Political parties existed in other countries before America was even formed. In England, the two dominant parties were the Tories and the Whigs. There were no political parties in the United States when our nation was first formed. The founders had seen parties in England, the Whigs and the Tories, cause great damage to their old country, and they wanted to avoid that happening in their new country. But, as we learned earlier in this semester, Two groups of people who share differing beliefs about the proper balance of power between the national and state government coalesced during the ratification debates for the U.S. Constitution. We called them the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. They were not political parties at all, but rather the precursor to the parties that developed a few decades later. Federalists dominated the government for the first 10 years, and the Anti-Federalists were not very well organized. But despite their lack of organization, the Anti-Federalist voice was strong, strong enough to force Federalists to compromise on many issues and to amend the Constitution with the Bill of Rights. It was during President George Washington's presidential administration that organized political parties began to form. To tell that story of how the political parties formed, I'm going to provide you with a link to watch a short video. That link will be on page 4 of this learning module, and one of your learning module assignments will be to complete a viewing guide for that video. But for now, let's look at the present day status of political parties. The two dominant political parties in America today are, of course, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The names of these two parties have been in use since the early 1800s, but as you'll see in the video, their platforms have shifted dramatically over the past century or so. The Democratic and Republican parties of today are decidedly not the Democratic and Republican parties of old. But what we have today is this. As far as the Democratic platform goes, we'll see a desire for a larger government role in the economy, a desire for the enactment of regulations that support conservation and environmental protection, desire for larger infrastructure for government services for the poor, more progressive taxation where tax rates are proportional to wealth, greater freedom in the expression of gender identity and sexuality. Democrats tend to oppose restrictions on abortion access, prefer multilateralism in foreign policy, and the Democratic Party is usually more dominant in larger cities. On the other side is the Republican Party. This is the party for smaller government or the role of the government being smaller in the economy. They would advocate for the removal or lessening of environmental regulations, for a smaller infrastructure for government services, lower taxation for all economic groups, a larger military budget with more of a desire for a unilateral action by the United States as opposed to America's cooperation with other nations through a multilateral effort in foreign policy. Republicans might favor restrictions on choice as they pertain to abortion access, gender identity, and sexuality. And the Republican Party seems to be more dominant in the rural parts of America. Now, this is a generalization, of course. I trust that you can look up the details of each party's full platform online. It's very accessible. And let's not forget third parties. There are many third parties in America. There are many options for voices and other groups that are not fully identifying with the two major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. Third parties have risen and fallen many, many times over the course of our history. Third parties tend to form as an alternative to the two-party system. They give a voice to individuals who believe that their issues are not being addressed by the two dominant parties. Sometimes they are single-issue parties. Ultimately, though, one of the two major parties will see voters drawn to support for a third party's primary issue, and then to draw those voters back, the dominant party will co-opt the third party's platform issue, and the third party will die out. Example might be how you might have seen the Democratic Party beginning to draw in the environmental concerns of the Green Party. That's an example of co-opting the issues of a third party. It is difficult for a candidate to be elected from a third party because voters who might support the third party candidate won't vote for him or her because they don't believe he or she will build enough support to defeat the other two candidates. So it is very rare to see a third party candidate actually succeed in an election. And sadly, sometimes third parties will do themselves more harm than good. Their candidate may draw voters away from the dominant party that is most aligned with their third party position. The result then is too few voters for either the third party candidate or the most aligned dominant party candidate. And then the election victory will go to the dominant party who actually opposes their issue. An example from the 1990s is Ross Perot. He was a very pro-business presidential candidate. And although he was pro-business and most aligned with the Republican Party, he chose to run as an independent. And when election time came, several voters left the Republican Party and cast their votes for Ross Perot instead of Republican George Bush. And that split the conservative vote. So the winner was the Democratic candidate Bill Clinton, the candidate least aligned with Ross Perot's agenda. So the lesson to be learned here, third parties are great for giving voice to new ideas and concerns, but they can wind up preventing the implementation of their agenda by splitting the vote between two candidates with neither having enough votes to beat the candidate who most opposes their agenda. Your viewing guide for the learning module assignment I mentioned ago will include a shorter video about the history of third parties in America, so you'll learn more about how they have risen and fallen over the course of American history. Next, we'll move on to voting and making political choices. Voting begins with registration, and voter registration is handled at the state government level. There are certain limits placed on state governments by the judicial branch of our national government, but that's to ensure that minority groups are treated equally. Beyond that, their state governments would be in control of voter registration procedures. There are 3 basic requirements for registering to vote, and they mirror the qualifications for public office. One must be at least 18 years old, so there'll be an age requirement. You must be a U.S. citizen, a citizenship requirement, and you must be a resident. So age, citizenship, and residency. Those are the 3 basic requirements that every state in the U.S. imposes for registration. But beyond those 3 basic requirements, state laws will vary quite a bit, particularly with respect to these issues. Voter identification. Some states don't even require someone to show identification when they register to vote. Others require certain very specific types of identification, and some states even require government-issued photo identification, and that would include the state of South Carolina. It is rather strict about voting. There's variation in how people may register to vote. Although it would be rare, in my opinion, some states still require paper applications to register to vote, while most states allow for online registration. Another variation can be seen in the length of your residency before you're qualified to vote. Some states require you to be a resident for longer than others before you register to vote. Some states prohibit convicted felons from ever voting. Most states prohibit convicted felons, even after they've served their time in prison, from ever getting the right to vote back. There's also some variation in timing. States may vary the amount of time after you register before you may cast a vote. A few states allow you to vote on the same day that you register, but most do not. The overall goal of any democratic society is obviously to have high voter turnout, high engagement by citizens in the voting process. But registration laws can make it much more difficult for people to vote and will decrease voter turnout. We already studied the effects of black codes and Jim Crow laws in the South that interfered with voter registration by African Americans. And then we also studied the Voting Rights Act and how it was effective in removing some of those restrictions and subsequently greatly increased voter turnout among African Americans. High voter turnout, though, is the goal of any democratic government. So now let's look at how voter turnout is calculated. How it is calculated depends on certain choices, and those choices go into a ratio. Obviously, we have to count the number of votes cast, and in our ratio, that would be the numerator. The denominator should be some measurement of how many people could have voted. But how do you determine who could have voted? There's three different ways that are primarily used. One is registered voters. This measurement results in the highest possible voter turnout percentage because it is the smallest group, people who actually have registered to vote. Another option is to use the voting age population, people who are old enough to vote but may not be eligible due to citizenship, residency requirements, or even a past criminal conviction, or they may not have registered. And when measured this way, voter turnout will appear very low because this group is the largest of the three possible groupings. In the middle comes the voting eligible population, people who meet the age, citizenship, and residency requirements who are not convicted felons, but they may not have yet registered. This is actually the most commonly used measurement. That's why there's some asterisks by it. You'll see the voting eligible population used as the denominator in this ratio most often. And it'll give you the middle of the road measurement of voter turnout. There are several factors that do affect voter turnout. Political scientists have gathered data that establishes certain trends, often connected to demographics. Age would be a highly predictive factor. Younger people are the least likely to vote. Citizens over the age of 65 are most likely to vote. Now, why is that? Our textbook says it's due to several reasons. Students and young people move a lot. They're in college. They're not really deriving government benefits yet, and they're less aware of political issues that matter to them. But I have to tell you, when young people don't vote, their concerns will not be addressed in their government. And that alone will feed into a conception that young people already have. The government isn't working. Well, it is working, just not for them because they aren't voting. Socioeconomic status is also a predictor of voter turnout. Education is the strongest of the two. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to be a voter. Wealth comes next. Race can be a factor as well. As far as a racial demographic goes, Hispanic Americans are the least likely to be voters, except in states where Hispanic Americans are already involved as representatives. Gender is definitely a factor, but it's only slightly predictive. Women are just marginally more likely to vote than men. Now, let's consider a little bit about how people are voting. How do people make political choices? Let me start with a little bit of vocabulary. Political socialization refers to how people come to adopt political beliefs. The collection of those political beliefs is called political ideology. Political ideology tends to stabilize in adulthood. So what you think now, your beliefs now, are unlikely to change unless you experience some sort of traumatic event. The things that influence your political beliefs are known as agents of political socialization. Now we'll look specifically at political socialization. How do voters make political choices? Well, oftentimes voters make choices based on something called heuristics, shortcuts, cues on how a person might vote, such as political parties. If you identify with a political party, you might choose to vote in accordance with your political party platform. This might lead you to engage in straight ticket voting. You'll see an option at the voting booth to vote for the candidates in every race who are in your political party. If you choose straight ticket voting, you won't even be presented with the opportunity to cast a vote in any specific race. Your vote will be decided for all races all at once based entirely upon the political party you choose to vote with. Some people choose to vote based upon the demographic information about a candidate. They may draw assumptions based on a candidate's age, gender, race, believing that the more like you a candidate is, the more likely you would vote for him or her. Some people rely on endorsements. Candidates may receive endorsements from newspapers, organizations, or even other political leaders. Voters then learn who has been endorsed by whom and vote accordingly. Connected to that is that voters may be influenced by political elites. These are people who are influential simply by virtue of their wealth or institutional power. Sometimes even their cultural popularity might give them a big microphone to express their views of political candidates, and then people who favor these elites will vote in the same way. The wisest choice, of course, is not to rely on heuristics at all, but instead to rely on your own independent research and values. But this would require a voter to be fully engaged in the political process, very informed on the issues and the consequences of a candidate's political agenda, and that takes a lot of time and effort. But it does work in your favor. The way people manifest their political choices is obviously going to come through voting. But people can also manifest their engagement through answering political polls. And so it's helpful to understand how polls work. There is a common perception in America that it has become politically polarized. So let's give that perception a little consideration. Party polarization exists when party positions have moved to their ideological extremes. When there are no moderate Republicans, no moderate Democrats, no centrists, members of political parties are advocating the extreme applications of their agendas. Political scientists will measure this polarization and its effects largely through political polls. And political parties, policymakers, and candidates will also rely heavily on the information gathered through these polls. So responding to polls then is an important type of political behavior. It may be time-consuming, but it is a worthwhile activity. Relying on poll data can be problematic, however, depending upon how scientific the poll is. Whether you are answering a poll or evaluating polling data, watch out for these problems. Straw polls. Straw polls are informal polls. They are not taken at random. The participants are not necessarily representative of any demographic group, and their results are not scientific. They are not reliable, but they are somewhat informative if you keep in mind their unreliability and are careful not to make generalizations. I'll give you an example of a straw poll that I often do in my face-to-face sections of political science. If I asked you all to say whether comprehensive final exams were fair and told you to email me your response right now, that would be a straw poll because it's so haphazard. I've not used any science behind my method, my questions. There's no methodology. It would be considered a straw poll. It'd be interesting to me, but I couldn't generalize from it at all. The other option, of course, is more modern scientific polls. And so let's look at what their qualities are. Modern polling is going to target the right audience for the information the poll is seeking. For example, to predict the outcome of an election, you'd want to survey the people who are likely to vote or people who have a history of voting. That would be the right audience. In my hypothetical straw poll, I've gotten this right, asking whether college students think a comprehensive final exam is fair. My target audience would be college students, and each of you are, in fact, college students. So I'd have the right audience. Everything else I'd be wrong about, though. Modern polling is going to choose the right sample. The sample would need to be representative of the demographics of the audience. Since you all are online students, you're not necessarily a representative sample of all college students. You're just one segment of college students. So I would have had the wrong sample. I also have not been random in my selection. I've chosen my own students. So I would fail there with sampling. And then my sampling certainly would not be the right size. My class, or your class, only has about 20 students in it, and that's a little bit too small. I couldn't generalize very well from just the opinions of 20 students if I'm trying to look at college students as a larger group. So a modern poll will have representative and random samples of a critical threshold size, the right size. The higher the number of members in your sample, the more predictive the results will be. But if it gets too large, then your polling is not as feasible. So you have to kind of strike the right balance here. Modern polls will also have a low margin of error. The margin of error is the statistical reflection of the accuracy of the results, or the degree to which the results of a poll will match the results you might get by surveying your entire audience, your entire population. So the lower the margin, the more precise the results should be. The timing of polls also matters quite a bit. For example, in elections, last-second events can change a person's voting very quickly. So to really have an accurate poll for predicting the outcome of an election, you'll need to use exit polls. Exit polls are when people are asked how they actually voted as they exit the voting booth. So it makes sense that these would be particularly reliable. Any poll question should be free of framing. Framing has to do with often has to do with word choice. When the question feeds information intended to sway the response, then the response is not reliable. And I'll give you an example. This is a very modern example. I might ask you, considering the volatility of the stock market and the declining value of the American dollar, do you approve of President Trump's decision to engage in a tariff war? Now, that is a loaded question, if there ever was one. It is unfairly framed. Your answer would not be reliable because the question I asked is intended to draw attention to the negative aspect of the topic, tariffs, and then to elicit an answer that is critical of the tariff war. So it would be an unfairly framed question. Modern polls would be free of framing. They would not plant information in the question that could provoke a specific answer. A particularly egregious form of framing is known as a push poll. These are not actually polls at all, but rather just an effort to manipulate the electorate. An example occurred a couple of times in South Carolina's history. One several years ago when Senator John McCain was running against George W. Bush for the presidency, and a polling company or someone posing as a polling company started, I believe they were calling people on the telephone and asking them questions about their whether they favor John McCain over George Bush. But in the question, they suggested that John McCain had forced his wife to raise an illegitimate child, a child that John McCain had had outside his marriage. Now, this was entirely false. It was not true at all. But the company or the anonymous company that was conducting this survey was trying to sway voters in South Carolina against John McCain. And it may have contributed to his loss in trying to get the primary nomination in South Carolina. So push polls then are really just ways to manipulate voters and not to actually determine who a voter might cast their vote for or not. A very popular poll that is used by candidates and people who've already elected and serving in government are called approval ratings or favorability polls. These polls are used to measure public opinion about people who are already elected or running for election. They're conducted very frequently, especially during presidential campaigns close to the election, and then after the election to determine how voters feel about the choices that elected officials are making. So these are called favorability polls or getting approval ratings. These are used very, very, very often. Our last topic for this lecture is about a specific agent of political socialization, and that's the media. I want to leave you all in this course with at least a general understanding of some of the ways that the news media can be helpful and harmful. But this is just kind of touching the surface of the issue. You would need to do a lot more studying to understand the way the media operates more fully, but I don't want to not touch on the topic at all. So let me just give you kind of an overview of it. What do we mean when we talk about the media? Let's make sure we're all on the same page here. Media are organizations that deliver information, and there are several different types. Radio, internet, newspaper, television, magazines, these are all different types of media. What do we mean by mass media? Collectively, all the different media organizations are referred to as the mass media. They reach a mass audience, a large audience. So that's what we mean by mass media. This slide here of polling data from the Pew Research Center. So here's an example of a scientific poll. This slide shows the percentage of adults who get their news from the various sources of mass media. And as you can see, the highest source of news is through digital devices. They're in the top left corner. The largest segments of the population over the past 4 years have relied on news from digital devices. So what's that tell us? We're getting our news from the internet. Probably comes as no surprise to you. Media has a variety of purposes, and that's what we'll move to yet. One of the purposes of media is the one I just discussed, and that's to inform people, to give us the news. But media is also there to entertain us, to persuade us to buy things, and as a check on the power of government. Recall from a previous learning module in which we studied the First Amendment and the freedom of press. The news media is an effective check on political power because it informs the public of government action. Informed citizens can then vote in response to the information that they are given. A free press, one that is not controlled by the government, is vital to any democracy. There are very few public news media companies. In America, the most well-known is PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. PBS is not funded by any private business, and it is not profit-driven. Reporting on PBS News is funded through public donations, subscriptions, and government support. It is accountable only to the people, not to any shareholders or corporate sponsors. But most media companies are private businesses. They are for-profit, which, as I'll explain later, can lead to problems. The ability of mass media to inform us has been dramatically changed by the emergence of cable and digital media. Cable, and particularly internet media, is much less expensive for media companies to use. So, more media companies have formed. Both cable and internet have led to a boom in the sheer number of media companies, and they are all competing to be the very first to share information with the public. News runs on a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week news cycle. The news is always on. Media companies, therefore, don't always have the time to put into editorial review or fact checking. They're in the rush to be the first to break a story. So digital media is much less reliable. Digital media in particular is much less reliable for obtaining factual information. Social media, while good in many ways, has added another element of inaccuracies. Because of anonymous commenting, we don't always know who is reporting the information to us through social media accounts. Owners of social media accounts may sound official and reliable just by their name, but unless you take the time to verify it, you'll never really know who's posting the information. Information in social media also spreads very, very quickly. You just take one click and you can share a news report with hundreds of your friends. And so can hundreds of other people, all simultaneously sharing a provocative news story. And social media has been notorious for proliferating conspiracy theories. An example you might remember from about 5 years ago was the QAnon conspiracy. QAnon being anonymous organizations spreading rumors and lies about candidates for the presidential election. Social media is obviously becoming one of the primary sources of the news, and the graphs on this slide are just showing you some statistics on how America relies on social media for its news. This is showing here the percentage of adults who actually get their news from social media, and it's kind of remained the same over the past 4 years or so. Here you see the specific platforms, social media platforms, that are being used by men and women, by different age demographics, education demographics, race, and then political party persuasion. This too shows the various social media sites, and it's demonstrating which ones have increased in their viewership over the past this would be about a year old data, but over the years 2020 to 2024. And you can see TikTok has shot way up over the past few years, probably coming as no surprise to you. All right, as I suggested earlier, media can manipulate the public because it is a market-driven enterprise. Media companies provide services to consumers and they seek to earn a profit for that service. They're trying to give a return on investment. They have shareholders, people who expect to earn a profit on their investment. So media companies have to make a profit in order to stay alive. They make their money from subscriptions, if they're like a social media app perhaps, but mostly through advertisements. Advertisers pay money to put their commercials on a social media application. And so they are going to make their money by increasing the number of subscribers that they have. The more viewers, the more subscribers, the more users, the more clicks that an app receives or a social media news outlet receives, the more money they will make. So they have a distinct incentive then to increase the size of their audience. This incentive then is what creates the problem. Media companies choose. They set an agenda for their publications. They choose when they're going to broadcast stories, how long their stories will be, how detailed or in-depth their stories will be, most importantly, what stories that they're going to share. And that's where I'll focus. Choosing what stories they share is where they catch the audience. The stories they choose to share will be the provocative stories, stories that shock us or entertain us, that catch our eye. Um, and then they'll want to also maintain the loyalty of their viewers. So when they identify the ideology of most of their viewers, they'll choose what they broadcast. They choose the stories that will validate the ideology of a majority of their viewers. That's called agenda setting. There are other ways that the social media can, or any media, can be manipulative. And this other example then would be framing. Framing the context of a story is one way it can be misleading. A media company could use episodic framing. Episodic is a type of framing where the story presents just the sort of the smaller micro perspective, like an anecdote, where you're just hearing the immediate details on a specific topic. Here, it's best to see from an example. So here's an example, and this is a real story published in NBC News not too long ago. Ukrainian refugee shares her harrowing journey. Katerina Belash, a 24-year-old refugee forced to flee from her home in Kharkiv, shares her harrowing journey to safety and her powerful message to the world in an emotional interview with NBC News' Cal Perry. That's episodic framing. You're hearing one person's experience in this story. Another type of context, though, is thematic framing, involves thematic context. Here's an example. UCLA Newsroom published this article. Podcast examines Ukraine-Russia conflict through the lens of history. Scholars trace the relationship between the two nations back more than 1,000 years to the formation of Kievan Rus. Right? That's called thematic context. It gives the macro perspective, considering the overall history of a topic, how it has changed or developed and across a wider region and group. But which one of these stories are you most likely to read? Which one is the more evocative and thought-provoking? Which one is the more informative? Which one is a better guide for your political choices about the Russia-Ukraine conflict? And I'm not going to answer that question for you. You have to decide. Perhaps both of them would be worth a read, though, because you can consider them both in making your choices to get both perspectives, episodic and thematic. Framing can also happen through word choice. Words can be very distortive, and I'm going to give you an example of two headlines here. You might read this one. A local citizen advocating for illegal aliens was irate at City Hall Tuesday, demanding special rights. But about the same event, the headline could read, a local citizen advocating for undocumented workers was at City Hall Tuesday, voicing concern over the lack of equal rights. Now, what are the connotations of the words illegal aliens versus undocumented workers? What's the connotation of irate versus the connotation of concerned? It's the same event, but depending upon which words you choose, you'll perceive different versions of that event. That's called framing through word choice. And you can see how the words they choose can paint a picture of an event that is skewed one way or the other. Another way the media can be misleading is through priming its audience. Priming means predisposing an audience to think a certain way about a topic. So here's some economic headlines, real headlines that I drew from one particular news source. This is a few years old, but it was the same news outlet. And these were the headlines, all on one page, one internet web page. Inflation soared to 40-year high in March. Stocks give up gains, end lower following inflation reports. Supply chain woes won't be solved by reshoring, report says. Recession risk rising, economists said. So that news media outlet, it was an internet media website, that predisposed their audience to believe that the economy was absolutely tanking, because those were the only stories that it had on that first page. They had primed their audience to have a negative point of view about the state of the economy. That's just an example, though, of priming. So watch for that as you're choosing your news sources. Another way media can be misleading is through using covert content, and that often happens through panelists. So I'm going to show you two pictures from two different television news. They also have an internet presence. But so here's CNN, and you see these official-looking, well-dressed panelists. Here's Fox News, same thing, like very professional, well-dressed panelists. But do you know who these people are? Do you know what their backgrounds are? Do you know what their expertise is? Whether they're trustworthy at all? Do you know anything really about them? Covert content is when a media source presents information as if it is neutral when it actually isn't. For example, a TV news outlet claims to be unbiased, but may provide a panel of intellectuals to discuss, for example, a tax increase. Unbeknownst to you, the panel consists entirely of people who work for a conservative organization. But because you aren't aware of it, you won't realize that you're only hearing one side of the issue. That would be an example of covert content. Content is overt if the ideology of those speaking is openly presented before the panelists begin being interviewed. And I have to say, most of the major news outlets will give the background of their speakers, and they may also inform you if the speaker has some economic relationship with the media company. But you should be careful. Be mindful of the talking heads, the people who are speaking on the news. Learn who they are and what their agenda might be. How we respond to what we hear or see or read in the media is just as important as the potential for bias in the content of the information. Citizens must not only be aware of the agenda setting and framing and distortion tactics I've just described, we also have to be careful of which news media sources that we choose to read. Political scientists have taught us that news media is almost always filtered through other agents of socialization. So what we might see on social media or on some internet site, we will take in, but we will also discuss it with our family, our friends, and incorporate it into our personal ideology. So most people are not entirely passive in our consumption of the news. But political scientists have also identified an important negative effect of news consumption, and that is called cultivation theory. Cultivation theory teaches that what we see in the media becomes our reality, especially when we see it repeatedly. If a person only reads stories that paint a negative or positive view of a specific subject, then that person will come to believe that the subject is in fact positive or negative. The news media cultivates our perception of reality. So news consumers easily fall victim to something known as confirmation bias, the tendency to search for, interpret, focus on, and remember information in a way that confirms our preconceptions. Another word for this might be an echo chamber. Echo chambers can create misinformation and distort a person's perspective, so they have difficulty considering opposing viewpoints and discussing complicated topics. Social media contributes to the formation of echo chambers because they use algorithms that determine how the news feed will build from the stories we choose to click on and read. The algorithms will feed us more of the same thing rather than giving up varied perspectives on an issue. So it is extremely important that you be very intentional about what news sources you select. In addition, how you interpret those news sources as you read them. So all of this discussion then about the mass media and social media as an agent of socialization, it's not only to educate you for purposes of this class, but it's my my effort to help you understand the news that you're seeing, understand how to interpret it, and become a more informed voter. That's the end of this lecture and the end of all the lectures that I'll be giving this semester. You should proceed now to do the learning module assignments for this learning module 12. And if you have any questions, of course, give me a call or email me.